Working a job on YouTube has always felt like working the drive-thru at a McDonald's that every Karen in the Maritimes is all piled into and taken an obscene amount of cocaine. But even then, I still find myself reminiscing about the period of about 15 years ago, back when we all said butthurt and the worst someone could do to you was go bitch and moan on 4chan. But since the rise of Twitter and drama YouTube, it seems we have industrialized abuse, where tons of slop channels run by the most disgusting men you've ever heard of churn out screeds and rants of dubious credibility about every single human being who looked at them funny. And if drama YouTube is a smog-spewing factory of harassment and human excrement, then might I welcome you over to the tech bros of this dystopian nightmare. Back in 2008, Lindsay Ellis, this is not a video about Lindsay Ellis being bad, I need to set the scene here, was hired by Channel Awesome to basically take a gender swap brand name and proceed to run circles around the guy who ran it. Then in 2014, after some things happened, she left and went independent. During that time, Lindsay Ellis and a handful of other creators basically pioneered the modern video essay, which was a genre that had always been around on YouTube but was in its larval state at the time. We used to call it the slideshow, or the rant video. But in the 16 years, fucking really? But in the 16 years since then, the video essay rose to prominence, with mostly Ellis to thank for making it popular in the first place. Unfortunately, her work had an unintended side effect. Now every drooling yahoo had a whole box of academic terminology to throw at people whenever they were in a rage. And thus began the death of media literacy, an hysterical moral panic through which entitled brats would find increasing ways to overreact to someone expressing a contrary opinion over something that doesn't matter. Did you know we're living in an unprecedented time of media illiteracy? The proof is all around you. I mean, I'm telling you in confidence, but like, I heard that someone doesn't like your favorite show. I also heard that they think it's bad. Okay, so this isn't anything new if we're being honest. Hardcore fans of basically everything have always shouted down contrary opinions with shit like, you just don't get it, or you need to spend at least 100 hours, or BRB reporting this for promoting terrorism for years. It's been the status quo of the internet since a bunch of pedophiles got kicked off something awful and created 4chan. But ever since the internet moved on from its primitive roots, ditching the rage comics in favor of Wojaks apparently, there's been an effort from the biggest punching bags of the internet to rebrand themselves as intellectuals, and thus all the usual flame wars have been replaced with hysterical moaning about media literacy. Well, media literacy ain't dead or dying, and I can fucking prove it.
First speech censored, the first thought forbidden, the first freedom denied, changes us all irrevocably.
Let's take probably the most infamous example of the death of media literacy, the right-wing Star Trek fan. On the surface, this is an obvious case of no media literacy. Star Trek is one of the most unapologetically leftist shows in the universe. It's a show about racial diversity and fully automated luxury communism in space. But it's also a show about how a strictly American-coded organization staffed predominantly by white men is the benevolent peacekeeper of the world, single-handedly holding up galactic stability, surrounded on all sides by cartoonish depictions of African people, Jewish people, and Chinese people, where the military is the ultimate force of good and benevolence protecting you from those evil outsiders. Gene Roddenberry was a very progressive man, often dreaming of a brighter future where humanity has grown up, and often believed that humanity couldn't get to space before it grew up. But he was also painfully American in the 1960s, so all of Star Trek's political messaging is still glazed in American exceptionalism. Watch the first two series and you'll find way more of the Federation bringing civilization and enlightenment to other people than you will see the Federation dealing with an internal problem. And when it does, those problems are often the result of bad apples, individual admirals or captains. Anytime a problem is caused in the Federation, it's the result of individual people going bad, not the system itself enabling and encouraging them. What defines a conservative, the bedrock upon which all of their beliefs are built, is that the system we live in is fine and doesn't need changing. And that's a belief that the most popular and well-known entries in Star Trek support wholeheartedly. The original series is preachier than Ferngully crossed with Steven Universe, but it still maintains that us versus them mentality in that it is quite rare for Captain Kirk to reconsider the founding aspects of the Federation. At most, he himself has to be individually nicer. There are often episodes that deal with 60s-era racism or abortion issues that were still hot-button rage points for conservatives of the day. There's an episode that deals with a very obvious parallel to American racism with aliens who are black on one side and white on the other, and discriminate based on which side is which. Subtle. But that episode is fundamentally about the Federation educating a decidedly less modern people. And conservatives love anti-racism when it's them educating or feeling superior to others. We are, remind you, talking about a nation that was doing ghettoization and eugenics while simultaneously being horrified by Nazi concentration camps, despite being their primary inspiration. I'd argue that kind of other people's problem mentality is the bedrock of conservatism, and it's a bedrock that Star Trek generally doesn't actively try to fight, because the entire premise is, well, humanity has grown up, all that shit is behind us. And not for nothing, but both Kirk and Picard are white men who project an attitude of dignified authority, and both the original series and The Next Generation are constantly part of arguments regarding which one is better. Conversely, Voyager is often derided as the weakest entry in the series, and it's derided that way because 1, a woman's in charge, and 2, it's the first time the Federation's policies themselves are really called into question on a fundamental level. It's the first time the Federation really has to learn from other people. There's also the way in which the generation for the original Star Trek has shifted. The late 1960s was the beginning of an age of anti-establishment baby boomers who proceeded to grow up and become ardent Republicans after diverting all the money to themselves. And as we're going to see later in this video, what tends to happen when people adopt a new philosophy is trying to bend and twist the things they already like to fit into it. Surely you must have noticed that Star Trek went from political science fiction with the occasional dalliance into nonsense of the original series to the safe, toothless Next Generation where Picard gives conveniently bipartisan speeches and the series tacitly avoids hot-button political issues entirely, save for the episode where it appears the singular they has been conveniently scrubbed from the English language.
Commander, there are no he's or she's in a species without gender.
Okay. For 2 days, I've been trying to construct sentences without personal pronouns. Now I give up. What should I use? It? To us, that's rude.
We use a pronoun that is neutral. I do not think there is really a translation.
And then into Deep Space Nine, which was certainly political, in the war room and treaty sense, like the Star Wars prequels, and which devolved into pitched fantasy space battles where they build experimental ships and like, I don't know, the Ferengi get feminism maybe. The teeth wouldn't come back until Voyager when the deeply personal writing of the characters made a lot of that hot-button political allegory return, along with the uncomfortable racism. Only this time, instead of handsome Captain Kirk, it was the unyielding Captain Catherine Janeway, the birthplace of 1,000 mommy kinks, who would fly the ship into a binary pulsar just to spite some aliens and actively shut down the Nuremberg defense.
Please, show them leniency. They were only following my orders.
Their mistake.
And her indigenous first officer, and her black security officer and Hispanic chief engineer. In fact, the only white guy on the bridge is the criminal fuck-up. And also, that whole Federation as the bastion of morality thing falls apart here because Voyager often has to break those rules to get home, implicitly showing the Federation to be flawed and not the best decision in every situation, cracking that mythology that allows conservative ideology to flourish. Hey, I wonder why Trekkies often call this show the weakest. It's a fucking mystery, ain't it? If anything, modern Star Trek takes an almost perverse glee in tearing that idea of the Federation down in the name of the almighty Grimdark, which certainly explains why conservative Trek fans are complaining now, as opposed to years ago, you know, aside from the usual woman-bad arguments. So when you really look at it, the concept of a conservative Star Trek fan, at least for the earliest works, is actually really easy to understand, and isn't the searing contradiction people make it out to be. In fact, the only argument in support of this being a completely inattentive act of idiocy is authorial intent. And authorial intent counts for pretty much nothing to most people. Sure, it's the win card for online arguments, but online arguments don't matter and have never mattered. Authorial intent has always ended where execution begins, and while Roddenberry certainly saw himself as a high-minded thinker, he was still just a guy with his own fixations and biases, especially moving into the Next Generation, now richer and more entrenched in the system, which is why the backstory for Star Trek always tacitly avoided specifically mentioning what it was humanity was throwing aside. So while a progressive got to see, now that we have proper social equity and have gotten rid of all that bigotry, we have reached the future, while a conservative got to see, now that we have meritocracy and have gotten rid of that affirmative action, we've reached the future. Intent has never been the win card that online fandoms like to think it is. In my experience, authorial intent changes with the wind, and it's always struck me as lazy to avoid making your own analysis and ask the author to tell you the correct answer, which is why I have respect for authors who are consistently unhelpful in that regard.
Explain, Carl!
Well, from here, it looks like a weather balloon.
I'm not in the mood for this!
I think it's just a lens flare and some dust.
Just tell me, Carl!
Another example of this can be found in All in the Family, again, one of the most ardently progressive shows to ever grace the screen. Archie Bunker is a very old-fashioned, set-in-his-ways kind of bigot. He's pro-segregation, he's anti-gay, he's patriarchal, pro-war, pro-government, and pro-military. And he always gets into it with his son-in-law, an out-of-work hippie who represents all the anti-capitalist and anti-racist talking points you've heard from BreadTube. But the thing about Archie is that by virtue of being the main character, you end up seeing way more sides of him than just the caricature. It's a progressive show with a conservative protagonist, so there has to be more layers to him than just cartoonish bigotry.
You and your wife were always cozying up to them colored neighbors, but I didn't think you'd turn into a lover.
Gordy, I'm gonna hit you.
In spite of his beliefs, he's generally kind-hearted, if angry as sin. He doesn't openly wish harm on anyone, he abhors violence, he has friends in pretty much all the groups he often disparages, and when he's around those groups, his rhetoric dies down quite a bit. Even when Archie is on a stint of bigotry, it doesn't usually take much to calm him down.
Who the hell wants people like that? Kids are not kids. I'm sure God sitting in judgment.
And she didn't hurt you, so why should you want to hurt her? Archie, I can't believe you'd do anything that mean.
Archie may be pro-segregation, but he balks immediately at the idea of joining the KKK, and there's an entire episode where he's actively palling around with a Jewish militant who wants to crack some Nazi skulls. And throughout the entire series, Archie is constantly the one learning the lessons and growing as a person. The Archie of Archie Bunker's Place is a very different person from the Archie of Season 1 All in the Family. Archie has never really been above self-reflection. When his friend Stretch Cunningham died and it turns out that he was Jewish, Archie has to seriously sit there and wonder why Stretch would keep something like that from him.
Can't believe this. If he was really Jewish, why didn't he tell some of his closest buddies? It wouldn't have made no difference.
Maybe he thought it would.
You would think conservatives hate Archie because he's just a guy taking all the L's, but no, they love him. This whole "I'm not evil, I just have opinions" shtick is how every conservative likes to see themselves, regardless of what their policies and beliefs actually are. It's the vision of themselves they've built up in their head. In fact, conservative fans of All in the Family are the real-life expression of Mike, a guy who builds himself up as this bastion of intellect and morality, only to be none of those things. In the constant conflict between Archie and Mike, Archie might have to take the L time and time and time again, but he ultimately takes the biggest W of them all when Mike abandons his family to join a commune, inadvertently proving Archie right about everything Archie ever said about him. If anything, Archie Bunker is the ideal conservative, and it's very easy for people to point and go, "Oh, he's just like me for real," even if they embody everything about conservatives that even Archie loathes, because, surprise, surprise, people aren't often honest with themselves and imagine themselves as a more idealized person than they actually are. Does this mean they lacked media literacy? No. They watched the same show you did. They saw the same character you did. They just drew a different conclusion from it. And Archie being a humanized person was intentional. What they lack is self-reflection. And in the big picture, they aren't wrong. If every conservative was like Archie Bunker, the world would probably be a much nicer place.
And isn't that just a little sad?
By all means, stay in this cozy coffin of yours and continue to play the prince. But I have to go now.
Revolutionary Girl Utena, I know it's pronounced Utena, but I don't care, is an anime from the 90s that is considered mandatory watching for every sapphic weeb over 30. I've seen this show 3 times at different points in my life, and if you only know of it through reputation, you could be forgiven for thinking it's a show about lesbians smashing gender roles and killing abusers. And while that is the barest description of the plot, it's extremely reductive and actually deceptive about the experience someone is going to have with it. The series has a lot of very gruesome and uncomfortable material, and I wouldn't feel comfortable recommending it to anyone unless I knew them extremely well. Utena is a series that throws multiple layers of visual storytelling onto the viewer, some of which relies on text that is completely untranslated in the official dub, and it gets so far into the weeds of that visual storytelling that it can be difficult for the average Dwayne to parse through it all in one watch through, especially if they aren't familiar with a lot of the symbolism the show loves to use. Worse even, it's a series that likes to deconstruct certain anime tropes, but it does this by playing them completely straight for the first 2/3 before getting really into the deconstruction in the final season. So the point where you really start getting into the nitty-gritty of all of these characters' dysfunctional relationships is after almost 20 episodes of Nanami fawning over her older brother in a way that screams, "Oh right, this is an anime what I'm watching." All of these things combined means that you could recommend Utena to someone, and if you don't pre-warn them about all of these things, there's a significant likelihood that they're going to bounce right off of it. They could easily watch the first half, go, "Okay, I see where this is going," and turn it off. And I don't think that's an unfair first impression to have. Some people think you're obligated to stick it out to the end, but I think on a critical level, the point where someone decides they can't take any more of something is valuable information to have. You can stop watching a show at any point you want for whatever reason you want. Your time is your time, and you don't owe it to the egos of loudmouths on Twitter to keep sticking something out if it has already become too much for you. I bring this up because Utena as a show has always been wildly open to interpretation. The show loves its metaphors and its symbols, and the creators creator is infamously tight-lipped about explaining what a lot of the more weird parts of the show are. Sometimes he lies and contradicts himself, and sometimes he gives hilarious non-answers, and you're led to believe a lot of the things that nobody can explain are just there to screw with you. So while some themes remain ever-present, there's a lot of variance between how people interpret the series, even if it was too much for you and you had to leave halfway through. This should hypothetically be a goldmine for wild, out-there takes about everything, a place where people just figuring out how to read symbolism can cut their teeth, a place where a wild, barely held-together interpretation is welcomed with open arms and pop beers and demands to spill the contents of your mind prison. But it's not. Because Utena's status as a pioneer of LGBT animation means its fanbase is extremely aggressive regarding anything detracting from that title. So beware what you say, lest some ambitious idiot come by and piss in your mailbox. Multiple people have discussed Utena and admitted to the way in which the first impression left them feeling betrayed or lied to, and then having to watch it again. And I couldn't really fault anyone for dipping at the first opportunity. And this show is very Lynchian in presentation, and it's not for everyone. And on top of that, David Lynch never triple-kicked you in the stomach with codependent incest. If somebody told me, well, I tried it, but it was gross, I probably just gently inform them that it's a story that condemns abuse and patriarchal systems. But the way in which the series immerses you in abuse and takes as long as it does to get to the point is something I would consider a fair criticism of the show to make. You can't douse people in this.
Big brother, you really are the only one for me.
But Mickey's heart is slowly drifting further and further towards that girl. Further and further away from me.
You little...
I'll comfort you as I always do, little mouse.
Squeak, squeak.
And then say, oh no, I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. Some people just won't believe you. And that's okay. But Utena has almost the inverse problem of Lolita. When people talk about it, they talk about it in terms of being a gay show about smashing gender roles, and that's true in the same way that saying Undertale is a subversive RPG. You'll go in expecting Sailor Moon with sword-fighting lesbians, and you're not expecting to get a Kingdom Hearts world made out of Twin Peaks and flowers in the attic. But it's almost impossible to talk about any of this because its reputation to a bunch of Gen X otaku means that they're so extremely defensive and possessive of it. And if you have a problem with any of the depiction in the series, no matter how nuanced your position actually is, they just scream, skill issue, media literacy, brain rot, until they break every blood vessel in their face. This isn't even unique to Utena, I just feel like picking on it in particular. It's what fans do with everything. Media literacy isn't any more dead than it was 30 years ago. The average Dwayne sitting at home watching non-challenging but thrilling Netflix soap operas today is the same guy who was going to see Independence Day in the 90s. That's the thing about art as consumer product. A lot of people don't like to think too critically about the media they consume. They don't find that fun. And if they don't find it fun, then they shouldn't have to do it. I find critical thinking and analysis fun, so I do it. What we actually have, and what we've always had, is a problem of bitchy little drama queens acting like disagreeing with them about something or thinking their favorite work is bad is some kind of moral failing. We've had to deal with fandoms acting like shit-flinging gibbons since the dawn of the internet. They have been the punching bag of everyone for as long as humanly possible. You know that spot in a YouTube video where the sponsorship usually goes? Well, we used to put this long diatribe reassuring the dumbest motherfucker in the audience that this was only our opinion, and if you had a different opinion, then that was totally okay. And we always said it like that, in that really patronizing tone, because we knew who we were talking to. We did this because if you said something even slightly contrary, you'd get the aforementioned gibbons shitting themselves in your comment section. It used to be that a large dislike bar didn't mean the video was bad. It meant that your video had made its way to 4chan and triggered a pack of very stupid, very angry people whose mothers were keeping them away from small animals and children. That is still the case, it's just that 4chan is called Twitter now. See, media literacy wasn't in people's vocabulary because back then they would just call you a retard and report your video for promoting terrorism. It wouldn't be until the rise of video essays, hey, remember that I mentioned earlier, that this pack of simpletons would get a whole host of professional sounding words to make what was at best blatantly obvious harassment sound like something more significant than it actually is. And now we have an entire generational overlap raised in an environment where the behavior and mannerisms of a Chan troll are the default status of some of the most popular social media platforms on the planet, all while using the language of Lindsay Ellis to prop that up, like a corpse being animated on strings by the fucking Goler clan. The thing is, you get these people talking long enough and they'll soon demonstrate that they don't have the media literacy that they think other people lack. A while back on Tumblr, we were discussing the problem of the whole villain that has a point trope and how it often simply devolves into centrist or conservative proselytizing. And someone came in with a big monologue about how it can be really good if it's done well. And I had had quite enough of that mealy-mouthed vague crap where they gesture to some hypothetical good version of a bad trope and just straight up said, name 50. Well, two of Twitter's biggest cockroaches, Crimson Ender and Anthony Gramaglia, rose to the occasion and offered 50 examples. Bear in mind, this discussion was about villains who had a point being done well, which meant that 1. The villain had to have a point, 2. The story had to make them work as a villain, as most of them suffer from the main issue of, if they're right, why aren't we siding with them without straight up making them a genocidal murderer out of nowhere, and 3. They had to be good. There's also an unspoken rule that they had to be villains in the first place. That might go without saying, but just bear with me here. So with all that in mind, did these two men rise to the challenge? Well, most of their examples were anime characters from anime that I had never heard of, but here's the list of the ones I did recognize. Crimson opened with Josh Kiryu, who is technically an antagonist, but whose point is largely directed at Neku's personal failings. Then he moved on to V, who was immediately disqualified because he isn't the villain of V for Vendetta. The Norse Fire Party is. Then he moves on to Light Yagami, who is kind of a villain protagonist, but he fails at the first one because he doesn't have a point. He's just a maniac with a god complex. That's the whole point of that story. Then Xehanort. Yes, that Xehanort. The I want to be a dictator because people are dark and evil Xehanort. Then Azula, who is a villain but never actually makes a point in the entire series. Remember, having a point means saying something that is objectively correct and it being agreeable. Then we have Killmonger, who doesn't so much make a point as he does repeat a point that other people have made within the entire film. If anything, Killmonger is a symptom of Wakanda's isolation and indifference to the rest of the world. But I'll admit I'm splitting hairs, so fine, here's one. The next one, and I swear this is true, was Ashley Graves. Ashley fucking Graves. A self-hating, misogynistic psychopath whose only significant motivation is getting stuffed with brother dick. Again, she never makes a point in the entire plot. Sure, she gaslights and Darvos like crazy, but that's on you if you believed any of it. To that end, the next one on the list is Andrew, who is immediately disqualified because the villains of that game are Toxasoda and Ashley. But even if we did count him, he once again doesn't actually make a point. His whole character is he's trauma bonded to his sister, and he's extremely evasive about his crimes. Several other characters on this list who fail because they never actually make a point: Gollum, Satan himself, Sweeney Todd, Solus, Starscream, no really, he puts Starscream on here, Invader Zim, Frankenstein's monster, Simon Laura, two villains from Sailor Moon, Annie Wilkes, Davy Jones, and Two-Face. Moving on to Anthony. Anthony cited John Hammond, who isn't a villain, just a man whose vision outweighed common sense, Magneto, who is the exact poster child for boiling kittens in lava, Walter Peck, whose only role as a villain is being a government regulator during the Reagan years. Watch that film again, you'll notice a very capitalist bent to it. N, who never makes a point because everything he believes ends up being the deluded ramblings instilled to him by a lying prick. Imhotep, whose only motivation is reviving his lover, and the evil comes from the fact that he must kill to get it. Molly Hale, who again doesn't make a point and isn't even a villain. Nobody treats her as one. She's just a kid who misses her dad. That's not a villain, Anthony. That is a baby. Then there's Long John Silver, who doesn't make a point and is operating on the sunk cost fallacy. He's a cautionary tale, my guy. Medusa, who is not a villain. Miles Edgeworth, who is not a villain. He's just a state prosecutor doing his job. Multiple iterations of Dracula, who is a very simple predation and exploitation by the wealthy allegory. Donkey Kong, who isn't a villain. The grandmother from Encanto, who isn't a villain, doesn't make a point and is the one who learns in the end. King Kong and Godzilla, who are animals. John Kramer, who is a lunatic with a god complex. Satan again. And the last one was any entity that exists beyond good or evil with moral structures that cannot be slotted into our human term, which was disqualified because it was non-specific. Human terms are how all of literature is made, so nothing is truly outside the realm of good and evil, and that entire scale from cosmic horror entities to deities aren't real, so they cannot be compared or contrasted to anything. Now, you probably noticed halfway through, but it's clear that these two men grossly misunderstood what having a point means. They clearly read this as sympathetic motivation, when that's not what it means. To have a point means to express a correct or valid idea. To say someone has a point is to concede that they are right. This was something easily looked up, but wasn't as far as these two were concerned. And yes, these two spend their day harassing other people for their media takes because they disagree with them. And when they do, they conveniently avoid giving their own takes on media, or they get other people to do it for them. And they do that because they don't actually know what they're doing. And looking through their list of villains, their media diet is made up primarily of schlock anime and cartoons, comic books, and action movies. And so they hear the best villains are the ones that have a point and try to hammer the media they already like to fit into that box so that they can say they like deep and profound media without having to watch a real movie, or heaven forbid read a book without pictures in it. There's another creator whose bread and butter is harassing other people over their takes on revolutionary girl Utena, and loves talking about how media literacy and critical thinking is dead. But when she has to actually make her own takes, she was incapable of recognizing the sexual assault the main villain does to multiple characters, because in their eyes, his grooming of them meant that it was consensual, and therefore not rape. Bear in mind that all of these characters are underage, and he is not, and one of them is his sister. Bear in mind that when he's in the midst of grooming one of them, the road they're driving on literally says stop repeatedly. There's a point where she can't move because her foot is broken, and the villain takes that opportunity to assault her. Utena is a show with a lot open up to interpretation, but this ain't even symbolism or subtext. It's straight up text. Akio being a rapist pedophile is the most basic surface level part of the story that literally nobody should be able to miss. You don't even have to have seen the show entirely to know this part. This is the media literacy tutorial level, and she got stuck on, well, technically these 14-year-olds consented, which they can't do. So that's 3 people who love harassing others for their media literacy, having the media literacy of a dead cockroach nailed outside of a crack in the wall as a warning to the other cockroaches. And all because people disagree with their takes. And a lot of people disagree with their takes because their takes are complete nonsense. It's easy to believe that media literacy is dead when your takes are so dense nobody in their right mind would ever agree with you. The call is coming from inside the house, as it always has done. We are not seeing a death of media literacy. What we are seeing is a rise of extremely rude, abusive people using academic-sounding language to escalate their personal grievances to a societal level. It's not enough that people disagree with you about an anime from 1997. There must be some societal damage causing it to happen. We need to teach media literacy and critical analysis in school, except we do. It's called English class. Maybe the subject eluded you because they use books instead of anime, but that is something we do. There's a similar version of this in the way Gen Z throws derision on Generation Alpha for having skibbity toilet syndrome, despite the fact that singing nonsense songs has been a time-honored childhood tradition since Ring Around the Rosie.
This is the song that doesn't end. Yes, it goes on and on, my friend. That's enough, guys.
And Irreverent Gary's mod videos are older than most of you. But instead of just saying, God, I'm so sick of hearing the annoying toilet song, it has to be escalated to, the tablets are melting children's brains because I don't understand what they're saying.
I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me. It'll happen to you.
Oh my god, the kids are saying Riz. Clearly their brains are melting. This generation is doomed. Yeah, I fucking heard that one before. The word was shoddy back in my day. Remember back in the 90s when TV was rotting our brains because we were watching flashy cartoons about ninjas doing calisthenics instead of the cartoons our parents grew up with where a rabbit tricks a duck into getting his face blown off with a gun, and that dissonance was making them feel old and out of date? Or when the Game Boy came out and it was ruining children who had their face in a screen all day? Or when Facebook came out and the plague of 13-year-old girls posting duckface was the worst thing ever and was destroying a generation?
Man, I see kids everywhere with those stick hoops lately.
No, me too. It's gotta be bad for their brains, right?
Yeah, it stunts their attention span. I read an article in the paper.
Yeah, I saw that. It's like they lose the power to innovate because they're staring at the stick hoop all day.
Or hell, how about the over-medication of society? Back in the 2000s, you couldn't blink without finding some late-night talk show host, or animated squirrel apparently, bitching about how everyone has ADHD now, every child's on drugs, when in reality, the ability to adequately identify and treat ADHD meant that more people were getting diagnosed who would have otherwise been left to struggle and slip through the cracks of the system. In reality, old fucks were just cranky, that the world was changing, and people who had previously been left to just rot weren't acceptable to abuse anymore. Like, no, Janet, your kid's problem isn't that she doesn't apply herself. Your kid's problem is that she needs medicine. People take their personal grievances, be that annoying children, children you can't bully anymore, kids being kids, black people apparently, or being disagreed with on the Bird app for the brain damaged, and spin that into a culture that's ruining society. This is what the death of media literacy really is. It's what it's always been. And to that end, who the fuck cares if media literacy is dead anyway? What's the real cost of people's media literacy dying? You have to see their takes on your feed? I'm sorry, that's on you if you get so angry about that. I'm a YouTuber. I have to see awful takes in my feed every goddamn day. Just this morning, I had to read through a 10-paragraph essay on how an entire human history of art and literature peaked with some 20-season show about pirates for 12-year-olds. I had to read through that list of villains that completely missed the point of what we were trying to talk about in the first place, and that weird shrews pro-pedophilia arguments. I'm no stranger to the fact that the average person taking part in discourse has as many brain cells as they do eyeballs. I have watched people look me dead in the eye and say, maybe you just don't like RPGs, because I criticized the writing in a crappy JRPG in a video where I cited as comparison some of the greatest RPGs ever made. I have had people tell me films like Riding in Cars with Boys are boring because they don't have villains. indicating that they have literally never matured past the age of 12. I have discussed anime on this channel, which means having to deal with weebs and all the bullshit therein. At a certain point, it stops bothering you. It becomes expected. When covering the discourse around Hazbin Hotel and how a lot of people thought that the depiction of sexual abuse was fetishistic, hearing people jump to that wasn't even surprising. People lash out reflexively at works that make them uncomfortable all the time. It doesn't really matter. Give them a couple of months, they'll have thought about it a little bit more. I think there's this fear in some people that this kind of discourse might sanitize media, because that's another paranoia of these people. And first of all, media is already sanitized, and it's not because of imaginary Puritans. It's because pursuit of profit means trying to hit the largest possible audience, and the streaming ghetto has killed niche audiences. It's capitalism all the way down, baby! But second of all, complaining about something doesn't equate to trying to destroy it. If people bitching on Twitter or a single YouTube video can completely and utterly destroy a piece of media's reputation, you were probably overvaluing it in the first place. In reality, people bitch on Twitter about all kinds of things that bother them, and likely only them, all the time. That's kind of the point of Twitter. Less than 4% of the global population uses Twitter. Its opinions don't matter, and never have. The death of media literacy only starts becoming a problem if other people's boneheaded, or let's be honest here, personal and subjective takes bother you so deeply in the first place. Media analysis is supposed to be fun. You're supposed to be having fun coming up with ways to analyze media. If you spend all your time deconstructing other people's takes instead of making your own, well, you're a grifter. This just isn't a real problem. The general public has overwhelmingly preferred simple thrills in media since the dawn of media itself. And that hasn't stopped good art from being made. The rise of the blockbuster never killed unique and interesting and profound films. Streaming did. The rise of peak TV didn't kill off interesting shows that had interesting things to say. Streaming did. And the rise of the 100 gigabyte mega game with eyes bigger than its belly hasn't stopped good games from being made and doing well. Conversely, when was the last time the supposed Puritans, which are definitely real and not you just being a drama queen about people disagreeing with you, ever managed to successfully kill anything? The Hays Code ain't coming back, honey. You're just being hysterical. All the works we talked about as examples were chosen for a reason. They're all pop culture icons. Their status is legendary. They are beloved works of art. There's no chance in hell a single tweet or YouTube video is going to change that, no matter how influential you think it might be. If you think CinemaSins or the Nostalgia Critic, or hell, me, can single-handedly destroy a piece of art's reputation, I'm sorry, you are fucking insane. There's always going to be people who don't like the things you like, and no amount of screaming and harassment is going to change that. So maybe just relax. Calm down. Take a deep breath. In. And out. Anyway, Revolutionary Girl Utena is actually Stalinist propaganda. In this essay, I will...
This is the song that does it.
How do I turn you off?
It goes on and on, my friend.
Okay, okay. I get the joke.
It, not knowing what it was, and they'll continue singing it forever.
I can't believe you guys.